Hello, welcome to It Is Well, the podcast, where we explore the history of ideas through stories, culture, and art. I am Cynthia, your host, and today we're looking at something that feels incredibly modern, such as today's main topic, wellness. But we will be looking at it through a classical and historical lens. My guest today is Dr. Ed Cueva from the University of Houston Downtown for joining me today. Thank you so much, Mr. Cueva, for being a part of this podcast today.
Thank you, Cynthia.
To start off, please introduce yourself, including your department and discipline, and tell us a little bit about what drew you to your professional interest in classics and the humanities.
Sure. So I'm a professor of classics and humanities in the Department of History, Humanities, and Languages here at UHD. And as I mentioned, I'm a professor of classics and humanities, but my primary field is classics. Classics which deal with the ancient Greek and Roman world, but also with the ancient cultures around the Mediterranean basin, like the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Akkadians, etc. What originally drew me to this field was the sense that the ancient world, both Greco-Roman and the other Mediterranean cultures, really had something essential to say about the questions that we still struggle with today. So they've wrestled with it in these different cultures, and they've come up with answers or possible solutions to questions, for example, about ethics, about politics, about culture, and especially about how to live a meaningful life. Now, for example, the Greeks and Romans framed those questions on ethics, politics, culture, and how to live a meaningful life in ways that, for us, they seem distant because of the time distance, but also, oddly enough, they're really familiar. So I've always been focused by how they approached human experience through philosophy, for example, through art, through literature, and how their words and images still resonate across thousands of years. So classics for me is not so much about studying a dead past. You always hear Latin is a dead language, etc. It's not so much about studying a dead past, but really about continuing and engaging in a conversation that never really ended.
You're mostly interested in understanding the human part of the classical
Right, right. And yeah, and so the
aspect.
classics really are the humanities, prime example of the humanities.
Hmm. Perfect. How would you define wellness and well-being in the context of your field?
Sure, sure. In the context of classical studies, this is both, I'm going to give you two different versions, the Greek version and then the Roman version. So in the context of classical studies, wellness isn't just about whether the body is functioning properly. For the ancient Greek and Romans, it's more about a balance, a proportion, a harmony between body, mind, and spirit. So the Greeks, for example, the ancient Greeks had a wonderful phrase for this. And this is just a little bit of Greek, ancient Greek. The phrase that they used was kalos kai agathos, which translates literally to the beautiful and the good. So
Uh,
for them, it's just that true well-being, right,
mhm.
combines outward appearance with inward virtue. So, for example, the athlete with a strong body was also expected to cultivate wisdom and character. So, for them, what was on the outside reflected what was on the inside. And that's why they have what they call the cult of the body. You had to have, beauty on the outside because it reflects the goodness on the inside. Now, the Romans had a similar idea, and they used the phrase, now this is Latin, mens sana in corpore sano, a sound mind in a sound body. To them, well-being was never divided into compartments. In other words, it was really holistic. And so, for both the Greeks and the Romans, their views remind us or tell us, at least that in the classical sense, that health, well-being, was thought of as moral and intellectual. So moral and intellectual as well as physical.
That's very interesting, and hearing those specific vocabulary words for the Greek and the Roman over the Greek and the Latin, that's very interesting. We don't hear a lot about it nowadays, unless we actually talk with someone that, has all of that knowledge. So that's pretty interesting. Um, Another question for you would be, how is wellness and well-being most commonly represented in classical literature and art?
Okay, so wellness for the ancient Greeks and Romans appears everywhere in their cultural production. And by cultural production, I mean both their art and their literature.
Mhm.
So, literature, for example, we see it very early in the Greek world. We see it very early in the earliest examples of Western literature. We see it in Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. In Homer's epics, the heroes that make up the core of the characters in these two epics, they're praised not just for their strength in battle, but also for intelligence, for courage, for self-control. So, and then if we move a little bit down the historical timeline, we go from Homer in the 8th and ninth centuries to Plato and Aristotle. They also address the question of wellness. And what they say is that um, wellness really is based upon balance and moderation. For them, as I mentioned previously, they see wellness really not only as a physical goal, but also as an ethical goal, a moral goal. And in art, we see the idea of wellness embodied in sculpture. So, for example, you have famous ancient Greek statues like the Discobolos or Doryphoros, if you look at them, they're not just statues of strong men, but what they also reflect is balance and proportion, what Plato and Aristotle were talking about. The statues project, for example, symmetry. They project harmony. They project proportion. So if we look at the Greek phrase again, kalos kai agathos, which is the beautiful and the good, there really are symbols of that concept, which links the aesthetic beauty of the human body with the moral and intellectual virtues expected of their citizens. So it's these the art really reflects what, at least for the Greeks, what they wanted to convey as guidelines. Now, for the Romans, it was a little different because if you look at Greek statues, Greek art, you have the perfection of the human body. Now, the Romans did that. They inherited that type of art from the Greeks, that approach to art from the Greeks. But the Romans sort of added a separate dimension to the art. What they did was when they created their statues, yes, they can create statues just as beautiful as the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, but they also wanted to emphasize the true aspect of the human body. So if you look at Roman statuary, especially Roman busts, they'll have wrinkles, they'll have warts.
They're
Um,
more they're more in detail.
not much in detail because the Greek statues are very, very detailed, but
Hmm.
the Romans are more like real to life, right?
Correct. Yeah.
They reflect all the flaws and the imperfection of the human body, especially as we age. The Roman statuary depicts that age. The
Hmm.
Greek statuary wouldn't. They
Yeah.
wanted this perfect ideal as a symbol of what a good Greek was supposed to be like.
Very interesting. And I always saw that in between the Greek statues and the Roman statues, and the Greek try to paint like the perfect picture. That's how I like to see it. And then the Romans are, like you said, you can see when the person or who the statue that they're building, like the age of it. So that's very, very interesting. Want to follow up with that, how you said that the Romans tend to put, their details and how it actually is, with how that when you said about the wrinkles and all of that. How are sicknesses how are sickness and lack of well-being portrayed in classical literature and art? Would that be the similar way, let's say when
Well,
it comes to statues?
yeah, well, when for the ancient Greeks and Romans, when they depicted sickness, right, it was often more about it was often about more than just physical weakness for them. For them, for the Greeks in particular, disease was often viewed as a divine punishment. So, in the earliest example of Western literature, the Homer's Iliad, the book actually starts out, the epic actually starts out with a plague that Apollo sends upon the Greeks because the Greeks had violated one of the sanctuaries and priests of Apollo. So it was a plague that was sent down by the gods upon the Greeks to punish them. And the reason for this is that um, the punishment really was just symbolizing the imbalance within society. For the ancient Greeks, one of the things that you had to do was to respect religious authority, was to respect the gods. And if that was not practiced, then there was an imbalance in society. And what would the result be? Illness, disease. For example, if you look at the tragedians, for example, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, when they used sickness in their tragedies, they used it metaphorically. So, for example, if you look at Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, Oedipus Tyrannus, the Oedipus the King, the English title, um, what's being conveyed there is that when you have corrupt leadership, and in this instance, a king, what suffers is that the city suffers because there's an imbalance there. The king is not looking out for the well-being of the people that he's rules over. So the city suffers, and it's often the suffering of the city is often described as diseased or contaminated. The physical illness, once again, was tied more to some type of ethical imbalance or some type of social disruption.
Mm.
So, for me at least, this suggests that the ancients, when they described and depicted illness, they saw well-being as something very fragile,
Yeah.
something very delicate, something that depended not only just on your personal health, right, but also the location within which that person found themselves. In other words, it was not only personal health, but your well-being depended on the state of the community and its relationship to the gods.
That's really interesting. Um, In classical literature, how do portrayals of sickness often reflect the condition of society itself?
Right. So as I mentioned, that in classical texts, illness, when it does appear, really is a mirror for disruption in society, for some type of
Hmm.
societal trouble, societal disorder. And as I mentioned, one of the clearest examples that we have is Sophocles' Oedipus the King. At the start of the tragedy, what's happening? Thebes has been struck by a plague, and it's a fertility plague, a plague where the crops are not growing, or if they do grow, they rot on the vine. It's a plague where animals aren't having offspring, women are having miscarriages. So it's a fertility plague. And what happens at the beginning of the play is that the people cry out to Sophocles, excuse me, to Oedipus, the king, for help, for relief. But what we learn throughout the play is that the true cause of this plague lies hidden in guilt. It lies hidden in an unsolved crime. So here the sickness is really symbolic.
Mhm.
We have uh, Oedipus, who, if you read the play, he really unknowingly commits the crime that puts his leadership in a type of corrupt status. He unwittingly violates the moral order that then results in the infection of the entire city. So, if we're looking at this type of imagery, it really shows us how the Greeks and Romans um, saw health and illness more as a collective experience rather than just an individual experience. If we go back to Aristotle and Plato, for example, and then other philosophers after them, they knew that, so instead of saying the well-being of an individual, they preferred to see it as the well-being of society, which could get sick, could be diseased if if there was no justice um, for the citizens, if there was no type of moral clarity. And so you have that sort of counterbalanced with, what we expect for a well-being in the body, medicine, exercise, diet. So for them, it was really both. But sickness in the Greek mind and the Roman mind always was interpreted as a reflection of society.
Nowadays, when we look at films and art, they're mostly portrayed as a reflection of the inner world of the artist or the writer or the producer. And some think that it can be a way for them to express their mental illness. Have you seen evidence of this in classical literature or art?
Sure. You see it all the time. Um, and it manifests itself in many different ways. If you go back to if you go back to tragedy, for example, you have the story of Ajax, the great Greek hero, who is just second to Achilles in terms of, and Achilles is the best Greek hero. He's always addressed as the best killer of men, the best guy ever. And sort of second to him, or maybe third, was Ajax. And what happens with Ajax is that he has a mental breakdown because he's not respected for his abilities on the battlefield. And he goes literally insane. And he imagines things. He ends up committing suicide. And then, for example, we also have Euripides' Medea, who is a woman, sort of in living in a foreign land. She has betrayed her homeland. She has betrayed her father. She was responsible for the death of her brother. So she's done all of these things for one purpose only, and that is to gain the love of Jason. But Jason in the play uh, leaves her for a younger woman. And so this pushes Medea into deep grief because note what she's done. She's betrayed her father, she's betrayed her homeland, she's killed her brother. She's done everything for Jason but she's pushed into this into a dilemma where sort of grief and rage just overwhelm her ability to reason, and she just goes completely to the extreme, and she ends up killing her own children to get back at Jason. So we have these, portrayals of the fragility of the human mind. And the ancients were very, very aware of the ways emotional suffering could become destructive if not dealt with. And for example, in art too, we see images of mourning or frenzied figures that convey sort of like a state of inner torment. While they might not have had the same vocabulary for mental illness that we do today, they clearly use stories and images as a way of processing it. So, for the ancient Greeks and Romans, and particularly for the Romans, their art was a clear channel for expressing psychological pain and the dangers that can result from, that imbalance between what's inside and what's outside.
Yeah, classical literature and art, often show health and wellness through nature, love, or community. Why do you think these are so common in that specific type of literature?
Well, we have to be careful here because for the ancient Greeks and Romans, they didn't have the concept of, for example, environmentalism, right? Love of nature. I mean, some of the poetry is quite beautiful and it deals with nature, but it's not the same understanding that we have of the love of nature. For them, nature was something to be used.
Yeah.
Nature, love, community. Yeah, there were common images of wellness, and the reason for this is that they're always symmetrical. They're always balanced. They're
Hmm.
always connected. They're always harmonious. And because of that, if you go back to what I just mentioned previously, that balance is so important because it keeps them grounded. It keeps it, and it helps them live full lives. Now, for the ancient Greeks and Romans, nature represented order, right? Because if you think about it, what is nature for them? It's the seasons, for example, right? The
Hmm.
four seasons. And what do those seasons symbolize? They symbolize the natural and expected cycles of growth and decay that all of us will undergo. So, these cycles of growth and decay really sort of reflect the rhythms of human well-being.
Hmm.
Love was symmetrical, right? Because it connected individuals to each other.
Correct.
And it also sort of provided a sense of meaning beyond the self, right? Which
Hmm.
leads to community, right? If you go
Yeah.
beyond yourself, you go into community, especially in the ancient Greek city-state or the polis, where individuals were connected to the city in a sort of a type of love that was identified through shared values, for example, shared responsibilities, shared rituals. So for the ancient Greeks and Romans, once again, well-being was not something that was isolated. It was cultivated together with the people in the community, with the people in the city state, with your family, with your friends, and then with society. And that sense for them of belonging was just as important or as vital as food or medicine.
So I did a little bit of research, and I understand
I
that you
know.
are a fan of the horror genre.
Right.
What are ways in which the horror genre addresses wellness and well-being and or the destruction of well-being?
Okay. So, right. So we're talking about horror in the classical world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not horror in the modern sense, it's the same, but it's different, right? So this is what I started out with. They're very distant but strangely familiar.
Yeah.
But for the ancient Greeks, um, Kara for them manifests itself in terms of wellness, manifests itself in people like Medea, people like Ajax,
Hmm.
and horror for them, and it's really, really horrifying for them when the body, when there's a disalignment between the body and mind. Because what happens is that community falls apart, and they can't have that.
Yeah.
It's not today we can move from Houston to San Francisco. They couldn't go anywhere. They were in a city for the rest of their lives. It was
Hmm.
very rare that they would go out and move to another city. It was almost unheard of. So they were very careful to maintain that community. And if that community fell apart, then you have disease, then you have madness, then you have curses, right? So these were metaphors for disorder. So, and if you look at, so for example, in modern horror films, we have probably the most horrific um, um, sort of common imagery is that of a body that's broken or contaminated or transformed, right? And because of that, then you have chaos. You have minds that, are fragmented or minds that are haunted. They dramatize, the opposite of wellness. They push us to look at what happens when balance is lost. So if you look at the body in modern horror film, right, what's more horrifying than when the contained body, the body that isn't leaking, right? It's not wounded, it's not maimed. That's just completely, terrifying. So horror, like tragedy of the ancient Greeks, really teaches through fear. It makes us aware of the importance of this harmony um, by showing us what happens if you don't have it.
Yeah. Wow. That's very interesting. I'm not that deep into the horror the horror genre, but hearing about it and
Huh?
understanding it, it becomes very interesting. So I see why that's like your favorite. Um, are, across literature and art and film, what themes of wellness remain the same no matter the era?
Yeah. So across literature, art, and film, what really stays, what persists, are balance, moderation, harmony, the integration of the body and mind. They can't be separate.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, the Greeks spoke of kalos kai agathos, right? The unity of beautiful and the good. And while the Romans spoke of mens sana and corpora sano, in modern wellness culture, we still talk about this holistic approach that unites mental health with emotional health with physical health. The terminology changes, but I think the aim, the aspiration is the same: to live in proportion, to care for the body and soul together, um, to cultivate both personal well-being and social harmony. So I think those things persist. And the reason they persist is because, remember, as I mentioned at the beginning, these ancient cultures have grappled with these questions, with these dilemmas, with these issues. And the reason I love classics is because, as I always tell my students, is you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Go back to the classics.
Yeah.
They've talked about it for thousands of years. So let's look at what they have to say, perhaps just even as the start of our own investigation, as the start of our own conversation.
Yeah. So a lot of balance between everything.
Yes. Yes, for
Perfect.
them. It was pure balance, moderation, harmony.
Balance, moderation, harmony. Perfect.
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
love that. So that basically leads to our last question.
Oh, okay.
Um, well, what can the classics tell us about us today, and how can we maintain our well-being across a lifespan? So I think with what you said, the last question, balance, moderation, and harmony. I don't know if you want to add anything else to that.
Just that, what they do remind us, first of all, they're there. So maybe we should look at the classics. But what they do tell us is that, well-being is more than just about avoiding disease or living a long life. It's really, for at least for the ancient Greeks and Romans, it was about nurturing relationships. It was about cultivating virtues. If you look at the ancient Greek and Roman texts, they tell us that health, well-being is always intertwined with a sense of community. It's always intertwined with a sense of justice. And even, for the ancient Greeks, kalos kagathos, even intertwined with beauty. So, for them, well-being was holistic. It was a whole. You had to be physically strong. You had to be mentally sharp. You had to be socially connected. You had to be morally grounded. And I think that these lessons are very relevant because they push us towards a fuller vision of life. One, as I mentioned, where wellness is not just the absence of sickness, but the presence of things that support us in every aspect of our existence.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to help me and, understand more about the classical literature and art. We had a lot of wonderful information today over the topic of wellness, and I couldn't be any more interested in this topic. From balance in the old times to balance in films, wellness has always been a part of our culture as much as our medical one. I want to thank my special guest today, Professor Cueva, for joining me today and helping us understand how wellness portrayals are even in our day to day.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, listeners, for joining in today to Is It Well, the podcast. We hope to see you again in our next episode. Be blessed. Stay well.